"Get that wheelchair out of here. You're in the way." The shout rang through the roadside diner in Corpus Christi, Texas. Every eye turned toward the old man sitting quietly in the corner, his sinewy hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. On the table, a faded baseball cap embroidered with the words U.S. Navy SEAL lay neatly in place, as if daring anyone to mock him. No one knew he had once swum through the night in a sea of fire to save his teammates. They only saw an old man missing a leg. But 30 minutes later, the sound of a Humvee engine would make the entire diner stand at attention. In the corner of the room, Frank Dalton sat motionless, his sinewy hands resting lightly on the armrests of his wheelchair. In front of him, a faded baseball cap embroidered with the words U.S. Navy SEAL lay neatly on the table like a talisman, or perhaps a silent reminder to anyone who thought they knew everything about this man. Frank was 72, a former U.S. Navy SEAL who had served for more than 2 decades across oceans and deserts alike. He lost his left leg during an operation in Fallujah in 2004, pulling a wounded teammate out of the line of fire. Since retiring from the service, he had moved to live near the shore in Corpus Christi, Texas, a place where the smell of salt and the sound of ship horns blended into the slow rhythm of life for those long accustomed to strong winds and rough seas. On most days, Frank started his morning by rolling his chair to the Harbor Light Diner, ordering a cup of strong black coffee, and quietly reading the local paper. He favored the table by the window, where he could see the harbor and watch the fishing boats return from long trips at sea. To some in town, Frank was a familiar figure, a quiet, polite veteran who sometimes offered a faint but genuine smile. To strangers, he was simply the old guy in the wheelchair taking up a table that could be serving more paying customers. That morning, the diner was busier than usual. A group of dock workers had just come off the night shift, their booming voices drowning out the country music playing from an old speaker. At another corner, a few unfamiliar young men who had just arrived in town were gathered, beer bottles in hand even though it was barely past 9 a.m. They seemed used to being the center of noisy attention, but soon, their eyes were drawn toward Frank. He kept turning the pages of his newspaper, his eyes moving slowly across each column of small print, as if unaware he was being watched. But from his years in the military, Frank had learned how to read a room without ever looking directly, and this room was slowly losing its natural balance. A derisive chuckle came from the young men's table. It was followed by a few half-joking, half-pointed remarks loud enough for those nearby to hear, but not clear enough to warrant an immediate confrontation. Frank didn't react. He didn't need to. In his mind, the sea was still rolling in steady waves, like the rhythm of his breathing during a stakeout. Lucy, the young waitress who had only been working at the diner for a few months, passed by his table with a polite smile. Frank returned the gesture with a slight nod. She'd heard somewhere that he was a SEAL, but she'd also seen him spend entire mornings just reading and sipping coffee, never acting like a hero. To Lucy, that only made him more intriguing and harder to figure out. Morning light poured through the glass windows, catching on Frank's titanium prosthetic leg. The metal gleamed briefly, casting a thin streak of light across the floor, an unintentional but impossible to miss signal. One of the young men suddenly pointed toward it, whispered something to his friend, then burst into laughter. Frank set the paper down for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands, his fingers brushing against the brim of the cap on the table. It was the same cap he had worn on countless missions at sea, with his unit soaked in sweat, sun, and the salt of thousands of hours of training. To him, it wasn't just fabric and thread, it was a promise, a memory, and the reason he still sat here with his back straight, even after losing a part of his body. But to the men watching from the other table, all they saw was an old man in a wheelchair wasting a seat during the breakfast rush. And that was when, in the salty air of the harborside diner, the little things began to gather into a storm. Would they realize they'd just lit the fuse on the wrong man? The sound of knuckles on the table rang out like a knock on a steel hull. Not loud, but sharp enough to make everyone nearby look up. A tall man in a skull print t-shirt stood with one hand braced on the counter, a mocking smile curling at the corner of his mouth. His posture carried a kind of shallow confidence, the kind that comes from believing your voice should be the loudest sound in the room. Frank didn't lower his newspaper. The words on the page kept sliding past his eyes, slowly, as if the inked story in front of him mattered more than the man standing just a few steps away. Having spent time in smaller, hotter rooms filled with the clash of metal on metal, Frank knew there were some sounds worth letting pass through your ears and vanish. But this man wasn't going to let it go that easily. His boots thudded against the old wooden floor as he closed the distance to Frank's table. This time, the knock on the tabletop was harder, making Frank's coffee cup tremble slightly. The old man in the wheelchair stayed calm, his back straight, not out of reaction, but out of habit. The kind of habit forged in those who've had to stand at attention in the dark for hours, waiting for orders. A few laughs broke out from nearby tables. Not all of them genuine, but crowds are easily drawn toward whoever speaks the loudest. A younger man, with messy blonde hair, sitting close by, reached out and snatched the faded baseball cap from Frank's table. He spun it in his hands, as if inspecting some worthless antique he'd found at a yard sale. "This thing, what, you get it at a flea market?" he said, his voice carrying that smug curiosity of someone who thinks they've uncovered a secret. Frank extended his hand, no rush, and took the cap back. His fingers traced the frayed edge of the fabric before placing it precisely where it had been, as carefully as if it were something fragile. His eyes were steady but not soft. They held the gray of the sea before a storm flat, but charged with hidden energy. To an outsider, he was just an old man avoiding an argument. To anyone who'd served on a ship's deck in the middle of the Pacific, it was the sign of someone measuring the distance, reading the wind, and waiting for the right moment. A chair scraped across the floor with a harsh screech. A bald man, broad as a refrigerator, rose from a corner table and came up behind Frank. There are moments when a room seems to hold its breath, and this was one of them. Without asking, the big man gripped the wheelchair's handles and shoved it forward. The impact came fast, but felt slow. The chair jolted into the leg of the next table. Hot coffee splashed onto Frank's shirt, dark drops spreading across the fabric. His newspaper slid from his hands and landed on the floor with a dry, flat thwap. A few people flinched, but no one moved toward him. Some stared down at their plates of fried eggs, pretending to be occupied. Others turned toward their companions, whispering about something as mundane as baseball scores. Frank inhaled, not deeply, not hurried, and exhaled. He leaned back in his chair and adjusted his cap until it sat square on his head. Half his coffee was gone now, but he didn't glance at the wet stain on his shirt. In his mind, the sound of waves and the smell of engine oil were still there, more familiar to him than his own voice. Lucy, the young waitress, stepped out from behind the counter with a towel in hand. Her expression betrayed clear irritation, but the manager's hand came down on her shoulder, stopping her. He shook his head and murmured something. Frank saw it but didn't hold it against them. He understood orders and hesitation. Not everyone is ready to step into something they don't yet understand. A brief smile crossed Frank's lips, the kind only the seasoned recognize. It wasn't weakness. It was the awareness that the battle wasn't set to begin just yet. He bent down, picked up the paper, and brushed its cover clean. A few coffee stains bled across the headlines, looking like a small map of a war long past. From the other table, laughter rose again, quieter this time. A few people in the diner avoided looking directly at Frank, but glanced at one another, as if sensing something was off. The silence stretched another beat, before the shuffle of feet and clinking beer bottles filled the air again, trying to erase the moment. Frank set the paper back down and nudged his wheelchair into its original position. His spine remained straight, his hands resting on his lap, his eyes on the window. Outside, a seagull swooped down, snatched something from the sand, and lifted off again, leaving a few white feathers drifting in the breeze. There are times, Frank knew, when silence is the only way to keep certain things intact. But there's a limit, and those men seem to be getting very close to it. Do you think you can guess what happens next? Take a moment, relax, and drop a 1 or "I'm still here" in the comments to keep listening. The leather wallet hit the floor with a muted thud, worn to the point where the edges had frayed white. It lay slightly open, revealing the corner of a faded photograph. As Frank bent down to pick it up, the photo slid free, as if it wanted to tell its story on its own. In the picture, a group of men in black dive gear stood before a dark gray MH-60. The rotor wash must have been whipping hard against their faces at the time, yet they all stood firm, shoulder to shoulder. In their hands, weapons glistened with seawater, and on their faces was the focus of men who had just returned from a place where the ocean shows no mercy. At the center of the line, a younger Frank, black-haired, eyes sharp as twin drill bits, stared straight into the camera. The big man stooped and snatched up the photo before Frank could reach it. He let out a long, empty whistle. "So you know how to use Photoshop, huh?" His voice was thick with mocking insinuation, as if what he was holding was nothing more than a staged trick. Frank didn't answer. He simply extended his hand, palm open, and waited. The man smirked, but handed it back. As Frank's fingers closed around the photograph, he turned it over, giving it a quick glance, just to make sure it was intact, then slid it carefully back into his wallet. The next motion changed the color of the room. Frank straightened up in his wheelchair, lifting his left arm to adjust the sleeve. The worn denim rolled up, and under the neon light, a gold trident tattoo came into view, the ultimate symbol of a Navy SEAL. Ink that exists only on the skin of those who have survived Hell Week, and all the trials that cause 75% of candidates to quit before the finish line. The atmosphere in the diner shifted like a tide turning. An old man in the far corner, a baseball cap reading Vietnam veteran tilted slightly to the side, gave a small nod, his gaze hardening in recognition of a brother in arms he'd never met. At another table, a dock worker paused halfway through raising his beer. The group of young men still laughed, but now it sounded tighter, stuck in their throats. To them, that tattoo might have been just ink, but to a few in the room, it was a map back to a world these loudmouths would never understand. Frank began wiping the remaining drops of coffee from his hand, each movement slow but deliberate. He wasn't trying to look dangerous. He was simply doing what a man does when he's used to doing things the right way. But his silence became an empty space. Others in the room felt compelled to fill with speculation. A few people began recalling stories they'd heard down at the docks. About an old SEAL living in town who once swam through the night in Iraqi waters to disarm naval mines under a cargo ship, losing a leg while saving a teammate. No one knew how much of it was true, but looking at that tattoo, they started to believe a little more. Frank rolled back to his table, placing the newspaper exactly where it had been on the damp surface. His fingers tapped a light rhythm, as if marking time. To anyone observant, it carried the feel of an old habit, the kind you use to count down before jumping from an aircraft or before plunging into freezing waves. Lucy remained behind the counter, towel still in hand, eyes fixed on the tattoo she'd just seen. She had never met a SEAL outside of books and articles, but in that moment she understood this old man was not someone to be judged by the wheels beneath him. A flicker of humor crossed the moment. As Frank adjusted his sleeve, he caught Lucy's gaze and raised an eyebrow, a look that said, "I'm fine, don't worry. I've been wet in far worse places." Lucy couldn't help but laugh, a small smile that was enough to ease some of the tension in the air. But the young men weren't ready to let it go. One of them nudged another, muttering just loud enough for scraps of words to carry. "Old man, acting, one leg." Those words slid past Frank's ears like wind over a ship's hull, not altering his course, but noted all the same. In the military, Frank had learned that silence isn't retreat. It's the pause before action, the time you give your teammates to move into position. And here, in a waterfront breakfast diner, that principle still applied. One other truth also held. The past has a way of revealing itself, no matter how tightly you try to keep it shut away. The photograph, the tattoo, the straight-back posture, all of it had already spoken for Frank more than any answer could. And as those clues began to piece themselves together in the minds of a few in the diner, the air grew expectant. As if people were realizing one thing. If this was the first act of the story, the next part wouldn't sound anything like the hollow laughter they'd just heard. Would they realize they were sitting with an old sea wolf before the storm broke? My dear viewers, stay tuned for the next part 1 that will make you sit up and take notice. Take a second to drop a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see people joining us from all over the world. The skull-shirted man took another step forward, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden floor. The distance between him and Frank was now no more than a single breath, the smell of beer and cigarettes mixing in the air. He bent down to eye level, trying to impose himself with his height and bulk. The taunt came out sharp and neat, like a shard of glass. Navy must be real soft now if they take in crippled old men. Frank set his coffee cup down. The clink of ceramic on wood was soft, but it marked a subtle shift in the room. He lifted his head and looked directly into the eyes of the man leaning over him. There was no anger there, only a cold steadiness. The gaze of someone who had learned to read another man's intent from the smallest movement. His voice was low, even, and loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. You ever swim 3 miles at night carrying 60 pounds on your back with the waves hitting your face like hammers? The group of young men burst into laughter, but it lacked the easy confidence they'd had before. It sounded more like wind forcing its way through a crack in the door, loud on purpose, but hollow. Frank said nothing more. He turned his wheelchair back toward his spot, moving slowly, as though there were no urgency at all. It was a lesson he'd brought back from the sea. Never let your opponent know when you're ready. Lucy, a clean towel in hand, left the counter with a determined look. But after just a few steps, the manager stepped out, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. His whispered words were easy enough for Frank to guess. They're paying, Lucy. Don't cause trouble. Lucy stopped, but her eyes on Frank still burned with quiet defiance. Frank caught that look and gave a small nod, not in agreement with the manager, but to tell her she didn't need to worry about him. A slight nod, but carrying enough weight for Lucy to understand that some battles aren't worth joining, at least not yet. Outside the window, the morning's golden light stretched across the surface of the sea. The waves rolled in steadily, bringing with them the reassuring rhythm Frank had kept in his heart through years in distant waters. He leaned lightly against the backrest, one hand resting on his cap, thumb brushing the frayed edge of the fabric. The young men were still there, their conversation resuming but missing something, perhaps certainty. The skull-shirted man sat down, but his eyes stayed on Frank, as if waiting for a reaction. Frank didn't give him one. A light breeze slipped through the door as a new customer came in, carrying with it the smell of salt and a touch of dampness. A middle-aged man and a Navy veteran windbreaker stepped inside, glanced at Frank, and chose a table in the opposite corner. No words passed between them, but the exchanged look was enough to lay the groundwork for what was coming. On the counter, the wall clock ticked like it was counting down. Frank heard every beat, just as he had during long waits in the dock for the order to move in. There was a feeling he couldn't shake, the one that comes when the air changes, when things are about to shift from silence to action. At the next table, the blond-haired man leaned toward the skull-shirted one, saying something too quiet for anyone else to hear. They both chuckled, but their eyes roamed the room, measuring the distance to the door. Frank took another sip of coffee, unhurried. He knew that when people start looking for the exit, it means they've already sensed something. A brief, almost comical moment passed. A bold seagull landed right on the railing outside the window, tapping its beak against the glass as if demanding breakfast. Frank glanced at it, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. Wherever he was, the sea still sent him its private signals. In his mind, Frank reviewed the morning signs, the averted eyes of a few customers, Lucy's hesitation, the nod from the old man in the Vietnam veteran cap in the far corner. Everything was falling into place, forming a larger picture, and he knew it would take just one more piece for that picture to be complete. When the skull-shirted man stood again, this time turning his back toward the counter instead of stepping closer, Frank held his posture. But beneath the calm exterior, every sense was switched on just as they had been when waiting for the launch signal in the pitch-black waters offshore. Some battles, Frank remembered, aren't won with guns or force. They're won with patience and with the knowledge that your teammates will arrive at exactly the right moment. The question was, how much longer until they did? The rumble of a diesel engine echoed from a distance at first, just a faint growl woven into the clatter of silverware and half-finished conversations. But it grew, steady and sure, like the heartbeat of a machine built to cut through storms. When the shadow of a sand-colored Humvee slid past the window, the air inside the diner seemed to freeze. The vehicle stopped at the curb. A door swung open. Heavy boots hit pavement with deliberate thuds. Three figures emerged, not in the crisp dress uniforms of a parade, but in the distinctive green and brown camo of combat. On their chests, the gold trident insignia caught the light, glinting with the authority reserved for only a few. The man in front was a gray-haired Master Chief, built like a mast, eyes narrowed into two blades taking measure. Behind him, a chief petty officer rolled an empty wheelchair forward with steady, unhurried steps. To the right, a young lieutenant commander with a chest full of ribbons and medals wore a face both hardened and touched by someone who had known fear and learned how to survive it. They moved as a unit, like men who had taken thousands of steps together before. No commands barked, no glances exchanged. Every motion was in sync. Their silence wasn't empty, it carried a weight that snuffed out the earlier noise. The Master Chief stopped right in front of Frank's table. His broad frame cast a shadow across the floor, cutting through the golden sunlight streaming from the window. He stood at attention, right hand lifting in a salute with near-machine precision. "Senior Chief Dalton, sorry we're late." No explanation was needed. Everyone in the diner understood this was no chance meeting. Frank sat up straighter in his wheelchair, returning the salute with crisp clarity, as if his legs were still there. In that instant, his eyes lit not with surprise, but with the spark of a fire that had never gone out. The lieutenant commander stepped half a pace to the side, addressing those who had been holding their breath. "This man saved my life, and the lives of 3 teammates in Ramadi when everything was exploding around us. He didn't just lose a leg, he gave us 20 more years of life." A few chairs scraped against the floor. In the corner, the old man in the Vietnam veteran cap rose, posture solemn. A middle-aged woman with an Air Force pin on her jacket placed her hand over her heart. Dock workers stopped drinking, eyes locked on the seals. The group of young men from earlier now looked out of place. The skull-shirted one avoided Frank's gaze, shoulders drawn in. The blonde sat frozen, clutching his beer bottle like it was the only thing keeping him from falling into a void. The chief petty officer set the empty wheelchair beside Frank's table, a gesture that needed no words but carried plenty of meaning. "If you want, we'll take you out of here, in formation." Frank didn't move, just gave a faint smile, his eyes saying he was holding his ground right where he was. A touch of humor slipped into the tension. The stubborn seagull from earlier returned to peck at the window, seemingly offended at being forgotten in the middle of this scene. The lieutenant commander glanced toward it, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly, as if to acknowledge that even in an op, the absurd sometimes intrudes, but never breaks the formation. The Master Chief inclined his head barely noticeable, then shifted left, placing Frank and the lieutenant commander directly across from each other. Sunlight from the window lit the trident on Frank's chest, mirroring the ones on theirs, a language without words, understood only by those who'd endured the same hell. Whispers began to ripple through the diner, but no one dared speak aloud. The presence of 3 SEALs transformed the cramped room into the deck of a ship where people instinctively stood a little straighter. Frank broke the silence, not with a story but with an action. He lifted his coffee cup, offering it to the 3 men before him. Lucy understood instantly, hurrying back to the counter. Minutes later, 4 mugs of black coffee sat on the table. The SEALs sat without taking their eyes off Frank. There was no laughter, no small talk, only the comfortable quiet of men who didn't need words to know they belonged to the same team. At the next table, Jack Winters, if that was even the skull-shirted man's real name, no longer looked dangerous. He stared down at his hands, as if weighing whether to stay or go. But the diner's attention was locked on the corner where 4 veterans Saturday. Outside, the Humvee's engine kept its slow, steady idle. It was like the heartbeat of a warning. We came for our own, and if we have to, we'll come again. Frank took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, and leaned back slightly. There was no gloating in his eyes, only the calm assurance of a man who knows he's still part of the team even long after leaving the battlefield. But was this just a greeting, or the beginning of something bigger for this small-town community? The sound of chairs scraping echoed through the room, not all at once, but enough to create a wave of noise that spread gradually from one corner to another. The man wearing a Vietnam War veteran's cap stood tall, his right hand rising to his forehead in a salute that his aging muscles still remembered in every detail. A middle-aged woman in an Air Force jacket placed her hand over her heart, her eyes fixed on the trident emblem on Frank's chest. The dock workers, once loud and full of banter, were now silent. Some lowered their heads, others simply stood still, hats in hand as an unconscious gesture. The air, once thick with the smell of coffee and frying oil, now carried something different, the scent of respect. Across the room, the young men had lost their confident swagger. The skull-faced man glanced toward the door, avoiding Frank's gaze as if a single look would force him to confront something far greater than himself. He muttered something to his friend, then stood up and walked out, leaving his half-full beer on the table. The blond man followed without a word. The door swung shut, and the sea breeze rushed in like a long, quiet sigh of relief. Lucy approached, a tray in her hands with 4 steaming cups of black coffee. Setting each cup down on the table, she smiled, slightly shaky, but resolute. "Today, it's on the house." The Master Chief looked at her, a brief smile touching his lips, the kind only someone from the team would recognize. It wasn't exactly gratitude, it was acknowledgement. "We always pay our debts," he said, his voice deep and steady, "and we never leave anyone behind." Frank said nothing, only reached out to lightly touch the handle of his coffee cup, feeling the heat seep through the ceramic. He knew those words weren't just for him, they were for everyone in the diner. A reminder that loyalty and honor never come with an expiration date. In the corner, the Vietnam veteran had taken his seat again, but his eyes stayed on Frank. The woman in the Air Force jacket returned to her table, the smile still on her face. A few dock workers murmured to each other, perhaps already rehearsing the story they'd tell at home that they had witnessed an unusual morning at the Harbor Light Diner. The air seemed to lift slightly when the seagull that had been lingering outside the window let out a hoarse cry. One of the younger SEALs glanced at it and said something quietly to Frank, making him smile. Though Lucy couldn't hear, she guessed it was some joke about airspace control or winged reconnaissance. A touch of humor was enough to let everyone breathe a little easier. But the biggest change didn't come from those who stood or bowed their heads. It came from the complete stillness of those who had chosen silence earlier. They no longer avoided eye contact, no longer buried their faces in their phones. Instead, they watched, as if relearning how to recognize a veteran not by insignia or uniform, but by the way he sat with a straight back in a crowded room. Frank wasn't seeking attention. He simply took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, and let the warmth quietly spread through his hand. But he could feel that, in this space, his image had shifted. No longer the old man in the wheelchair, but part of something bigger, a reminder that honor does not die with the years. Outside, the Humvee's engine kept its steady rumble, like a promise left unspoken. The question was, what would change forever in this town after this morning? Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see people joining us from all around the world. Comment 1 if you enjoyed this story, so we can keep bringing you many more like it.